And let's start by me welcoming everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth session of today's conference. We've looked at the history of Jerusalem. We've looked at the international law and human rights. We've just had a session on religious perspectives. And now we want to look at the contemporary realities and plans to share Jerusalem. My name is Imad Karam. I am a trustee of the Balfour project, and I am based in London. Now, needless to say that the future of Jerusalem is paramount to peace between Israelis and Palestinians, between Jews, Muslims, and Christians in the region and beyond. The recent actions by the US administration, including recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, or the more recent normalization of relations between Israel and some Arab countries, is no substitute to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or resolving the issue of Jerusalem. Sharing Jerusalem in an acceptable way to all sides is essential to gaining a lasting peace. In this session, we want to look at the current realities and also future prospects to share the city of Jerusalem. Before we move into the session and before I introduce our keynote speaker, just a few points of order, if I may. For those who've been with us today, you will know that there will be no questions and answers at the end of this session, but we will have a dedicated question and answer session at the end of the day at 5:20 or about UK time. However, please do feel free to type your questions in the chat box. We will keep an eye on it just in case it helps us with the conversation afterwards. Also, to remind you that this conference and this session are recorded and will be put on the website, the Balfour Project website, by the end of the week, and an email will go out to all of you who have registered once the recording is available. My next point is to ask you, if you can, to please donate to the Balfour Project. As you may know, we run really mainly on volunteers and donations, and we have multiple events lined up, and we would really appreciate your support. A link to how to donate will be put in the chat, so please look out for it, but it also can be found in the conference brochure. Finally, just to remind you of the order of this session, we will start with a keynote speech by Daniel Levy for about 12 to 15 minutes, followed by our three panelists. We'll start with Judith Oppenheimer, and then Ariel Kane, and we'll finish with Rula Salameh. Each speaker, each panelist will have about 8 to 10 minutes. Whatever time left, we will have a conversation and a discussion amongst all the speakers. Now, it's really my pleasure to introduce Daniel Levy, our keynote speaker for this session. Daniel is the president of the US Middle East Project. From 2012 to 2016, he was director for the Middle East and North Africa at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Prior to that, he was a senior fellow and director of the New America Foundation's Middle East Task Force, based in Washington, DC, and also a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. Daniel was an advisor in the Israeli Prime Minister's office and to the Justice Minister Yossi Beilin during the government of Prime Minister Ehud Barak between 1999 and 2001. He was a member of the official Israeli delegation to the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks at Taba under Prime Minister Ehud Barak. And also, he was involved in the Oslo peace talks under Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin between 1994 and 1995. There is a much longer biography of Daniel. He's a very interesting and impressive personality. But for the sake of time, I think I'll stop here, Daniel, and I'll hand over to you. And thank you for offering us this speech, please.
Well, thank you very much, Imad, and it's good to virtually be with people, and thanks to the organizers. And as you say, I know this is all done voluntarily, so really kudos for pulling this together, for pulling a whole day together. It's a pleasure to be here with with this group of panelists. And thanks everyone for joining us wherever you are, and whether you're joining this session, whether you've been here all day, your presence is appreciated. Let me start by saying I want to try and set up a kind of big picture on the contemporary realities and possible plans. I'm not a Jerusalemite. I'm not living in Jerusalem. Others on the panel are, and I'm hoping they'll go into the granularity of some of the options. But what I wanted to try and do is establish a canvas, a kind of backdrop against which some of those contributions might be able to position themselves. And hopefully that will be a useful pivot. I don't have a detailed plan for the city, spoiler alert. I'm tempted to suggest that the title might better read as Contemporary Realities versus a Plan to Share the City, because I don't think we're in a space right now where constructive plans of any nature have breathing space. To be honest, if I had a fabulous plan, this is not the time I would be putting it on the table. Timing does matter. We need to get to a place where the respective publics, where the political actors, especially those in Israel, and I say that because we should never lose sight of the power dynamics, of the asymmetry of power in this conflict, where the different actors actually have to make choices between different plans. And we're an awfully long way from that today. And so I want to talk a little bit in a moment about that picture in terms of what might need to happen to create an environment more conducive to poring over the merits of different plans. Before I do that, let me make at least an attempt to address the second half of the exam question. If we can envisage a moment where especially Israel is forced to make choices, where the Palestinians have implemented an effective disruptive strategy to the status quo that has brought us to a decision-making moment, then I would imagine that on Jerusalem, we still have the three options that have been with us heretofore in front of us. And in a very distilled fashion, those three options are: if there is an Israeli-Palestinian agreement predicated on hard partition, on separation, two states, hard border, that would also apply to Jerusalem. That is very difficult to do in a city, hugely disruptive of the fabric of city life, very complicated when it comes to the old city. And to be clear, I'm not talking about the unilateral separation, wall, barrier. I'm talking about if we're in a deal-making space. One option is hard divide in Jerusalem. The other end of the spectrum, the second option, is we're no longer in a partition paradigm. That the one space reality that exists on the ground is in fact irreversible. And it's a shared political space, and that is the premise on which we come out of this conflict. That probably best serves Jerusalem as a kind of living, breathing city space. And the same challenges would be there for Jerusalem as there would be for the rest of the one-state reality, some more acute in the city. How do you move forward from a starting point of such great inequality, of such vast contrasts? One could say that in Jerusalem, more than other places, that's part of an already lived reality, with lots of caveats, of course. And then the third option, unsurprisingly, is somewhere in the middle, which is the big picture is a Palestine-Israel dispensation based on partition, based on two states, based on a border, but there are different arrangements. Jerusalem is a sui generis. I'm tempted to say a corpus separatum. It has its own unique arrangements, and there are lots of interesting ideas in terms of how that could work. I don't know, because we haven't conferred in advance. I don't know if the panelists are going to go into that, but obviously that's something that people have thought long and hard about. I'd say it's less on the agenda today because of where we are in the conflict. So there's a question, which is, does Jerusalem give us any important signals or clues as to which direction we're going in. My conclusion is that I don't think the end game will be defined according to what is possible or not possible, happening or not happening inside Jerusalem. I think there will be bigger dynamics in play. Jerusalem may have a larger claim to make on that end outcome, but I don't think it's going to determine and drive things. I don't want to go into what's been said earlier in the day in terms of what is going on in the city. I think we're by now familiar with that. What you see in Jerusalem is what you see writ large, the squeezed physical space for Palestinians, the displacement, the attempt to assert an Israel victory project, which is a control of the space, but it's also a control of the narrative. So the historical narrative, with the attempt to very conspicuously and quite egregiously write Palestinian experience out of that narrative. You see that especially, of course, in around adjacent to the old city and some of the not-for-profit organizations, often with Israeli governmental backing, that are operating there. You also see what we see in the bigger picture, which is, I would argue, Israeli overreach in Jerusalem that has not really led, though, to change. In other words, you could look at things and say, wow, with everything that's going on, surely this is now bumping up against its limits and we're going to see a strong counter reaction. And we haven't seen that thus far, whether that's to the Jerusalem embassy move, whether that's to the kinds of policies of de facto annexation, putting de jure annexation on the table. You know, that has a lot to do, of course, with the international zeitgeist, with the US. But it has a lot to do with the dysfunctional, unfortunate state of Palestinian politics as well. So there's not really a big challenge to Israel to change. I'm not sure whether Jerusalem also has the answer for us of whether we're heading for 2 states and 1. I've been able to dip in and out during the course of the morning and early afternoon. I've heard kind of both cases made. Does Jerusalem prove that actually we still live very separate lives? Or is Jerusalem an example of the irreversibility of the blurring of that line? I tend not to favor getting too bogged down in the 1 state versus 2 state debate, not because it's not important, but because neither are on the agenda in anything like the foreseeable. So I prefer to focus on protecting the rights of people on the ground. And certainly that is pertinent to a discussion of what's going on in Jerusalem today and to the Palestinian predicament in that city. One thing, and I'll close here and then go to the big picture. One thing I just throw in is elections. Of course, there occasionally emerges this question of Palestinian participation in municipal elections in Jerusalem, which is something that could something that Palestinians could avail themselves of. They haven't. I don't think they will, absent a fundamental, absent a fundamental shift in Palestinian national strategy. So simply to kind of put that on people's radar screens. Of course, there's also the question of Palestinian participation in Palestinian elections, if and when those take place, and Jerusalem has been an obstacle to that. As you know, the Israelis control whether Palestinians can vote, whether it's in elections to the Palestinian Legislative Council, part of the Oslo Palestinian Authority, or the Palestinian National Council, part of the PLO structures that predate the authority. I would say, of course, Palestinians should be able to vote in East Jerusalem. There are ways of making that happen. And the more we hear a Palestinian leadership precondition progress towards elections on whether there's a prior guarantee of physical voting booths in East Jerusalem, the more we should probably be suspicious that that election process is not actually moving forward. So let me move on swiftly to some bigger picture thoughts. And I want to touch on why is it that we're so stuck that in fact plans for the city or for anything else are on indefinite hold right now, constructive ones at least. And I would put three thoughts to you, and that is, first of all, the peace process has become such a goal in itself that it has become an albatross. So things are measured not against how does this play out for people on the ground, how does this play out for protecting the rights of Palestinians, but rather, is this good or bad for the peace process? And that is a very problematic way of looking at things. So I think we have to get beyond that. And that is the first thing I hope we would try and do. Secondly, and I think crucially, is the question of impunity. The absence of accountability for Israel for its actions. And in many respects, Israel's actions look rational politically when set against this factor of Israel being held to no cost or consequence for going with the lowest common denominator of where Israeli politics takes you. Impunity, absence of accountability, consequence-free bad behavior is not helpful in any sphere of life, and that applies here as well. So if we really want to challenge the contemporary realities, I think that has to strongly enter the picture. And finally, we don't have a disruptive strategy on the part of the Palestinian leadership. That doesn't mean that there aren't Palestinians in civil society, on the ground, in political structures, working to challenge the status quo, but that is not the policy. And I think until we address those things, we will be stuck. And let me close, therefore, with a comment on what does the politics look like here and internationally, especially we're a week out from a US election. So let's mention that. Look, I want to start with the UK. I really worry that in a Trump 4 more years scenario, this government could consider a package of recognizing the state of Palestine and moving the embassy to Jerusalem as a package deal, which I think would be a terrible move. I think the recognition part is symbolic. I don't think it moves the ball forward. If we want to challenge the status quo, I don't think that's the right thing to do. The alternative scenario of Biden, I'll get to in a minute, but I would just caution that the divisions we see in Europe are not going to go away if there is a change in America. And if we get an American policy that is shorn of the most egregious elements of Trump, but is a return to the status quo ante, then that really is still an American policy not fit for purpose. It's what helped get us here already. It's what helped enable and empower Israeli hardliners and ethno-nationalist extremists in the first place, which is not to say there's nothing to look for under a Biden scenario, but it means we will still have to work very, very hard. And this is going to be about people on the ground and people internationally who want to see really different policies, real movement, coming together and fighting for that. There's no automatic great shift on this issue, at least. On other issues, very possibly and very hopefully, yes. And finally, the region. Normalization has been used to try and squeeze the Palestinians and to try and isolate the Palestinians. Primarily, though, it's not about the Palestinians. For Israel, I think it is, because it demonstrates the efficacy in Israeli eyes of the Netanyahu approach. And I think it's been a huge boost to Netanyahu, not enough to overcome his other problems, but probably the best boost he's had in some time. But for the states doing the normalization, this is more about their own interests in the region, their own insurance policies. Sometimes they have simply been thuggishly blackmailed, in the case of Sudan, into normalization. What I hope is that we can have a more effective counter response to that. This hasn't been a particularly hope-inducing set of comments, but I hope that I've at least set things up for the panelists to come in. And I do want to repeat something that Baroness Helena Kennedy said earlier, which is I am an optimist, and I'm an optimist because we can get behind work that people are doing on the ground. There are great people doing that work on the ground. I can't see Rula, which I hope is just a problem on my screen. The panelists are amongst those people. But it does mean stepping out of our comfort zone and challenging a lot of what has gone before. And let me finish there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thanks for giving us this broader picture, also ending on a positive note or an optimistic note, because we cannot really give up optimism. Otherwise, we're doomed to carnage and a continuous path of suffering and bloodshed. I've been noticing the chat, and it's good to, and I would encourage people to continue to have the exchange, but please let's keep it, what's the word, decent or respectable, despite of our differences. The speakers on this session are representing themselves, not any government or institution. They're bringing their expertise and their perspectives. Let me now turn to our panelists, and we'll start with Judith. Judith Oppenheimer is a longtime human rights activist, feminist, scholar, and educator. Before assuming leadership of Air Amim in 2008, Judith was a fellow at the Mandel School for Educational Leadership in Jerusalem. From 2000 to 2006, she served as executive director of Kol Ha'isha, the Jerusalem Feminist Center. Yudith holds an MA in Development Studies from the University of South Africa. She's also got a PhD, and her doctoral thesis, titled Zion Square, Hermeneutic Study of a Public Place, was written within the framework of the program for Hermeneutics and Cultural Studies at Bar Ilan University. And that was done under the guidance of Professor Menachem Klein. An interesting part of her study was that it deviates from traditional perspectives applied in studies of Jerusalem, which are routinely subordinated to the city's mythical and political meta-story. At the core of the study lies a question regarding the feasibility of a worldly urban space in Jerusalem and of a terrestrial Jerusalem as a whole. Its comprehensive perspective paints a broad picture of the relationship between culture, society, and place in the Israeli space. Thank you, Judith. Over to you. Please unmute.
Sure. Can you hear me now? Thank you, Imad. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for having me here. I will read my words speaking after eloquent Danny. The Trump plan announced in late January grant for the first time international recognition of Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem in 1967. Until this moment, the only area in the West Bank to be formally annexed by Israel. This unilateral recognition was accompanied by far-reaching measures of separation and annexation that aim to unilaterally dictate the final status of Jerusalem and to impose an irreversible reality that utterly dismisses the notion of Palestinian Jerusalem. The US plan marks the separation barrier as the border of Jerusalem, effectively including within it the three settlement blocks around the city, Ma'ale Adumim, Givat Ze'ev, and Gush Etzion. Thus, even without further steps towards formal annexation, the Trump plan recognizes the de facto annexation of these West Bank areas, also known as Greater Jerusalem. This understanding of the de facto annexation was immediately translated into practice with the promotion of the construction plan for the Ma'ale Adumim E1 area, previously an international red line for construction, and recently with the promotion of thousands of housing units and accompanied infrastructure throughout those areas of Greater Jerusalem. Furthermore, the US plans establishment of the separation barrier as the recognized Israeli border of Jerusalem facilitates and finalizes the process undertaken by Israel over the past few years to formally cut off 8 East Jerusalem neighborhoods which the barrier separates from the city. These neighborhoods are currently home of 120 to 140,000 Palestinians, comprising more than 1/3 of East Jerusalem residents. Since the construction of the separation barrier over 15 years ago, tens of thousands of Jerusalem residents migrated to these neighborhoods beyond the barrier as an escape from the long-standing planning discrimination, increased home demolition, and the constant threat to their residency status should they fail to prove to Israeli authorities that Jerusalem is their center of life. These residents have found themselves trapped between the necessity to provide roof over their family's head within the Jerusalem municipal boundaries and the concern that Israel's ultimate objective is to sever them from the city as explicitly reflected in the Trump plan. It is precisely within this derelict enclave, containing and representing nothing of Jerusalem's symbolic assets, that the Trump plan wishes to establish a Palestinian capital, part of exhaustive Israeli-American efforts to reinvent Palestinian Jerusalem out of Jerusalem. Through this, the Trump plan directly contradicts its own declaration that, quote, peace should not demand the uprooting of people, Arab or Jew, from their homes. While it is technically true that the residents of this neighborhood will not necessarily be displaced from their private homes, they will rather be uprooted from everything that constitutes home in the broader personal and collective sense. Indeed, during the coronavirus crisis, we have witnessed several attempts to use the crisis as an excuse to close the checkpoints connecting these neighborhoods to Jerusalem, further severing them from the city. As we gathered here today to discuss the future of Jerusalem, the question may well be, the future of whose Jerusalem? The accumulated effect of this grave situation, which I have laid out, may well lead to a state of affairs in which the majority of East Jerusalem residents will no longer be able to live within the city, while those who remain will reside there as an ever more suppressed and subjugated minority. This will not only lead to a severe humanitarian and communal crisis, this will ultimately mark the end of Jerusalem as the present home and future capital of two peoples. The survival of East Jerusalem now lies not only in resisting, and this is very much in line with what Daniel said, not only in resisting settlement building and annexation, but also in safeguarding the capacity of its residents to live in dignity within their city. Therefore, protecting residency status, freedom of movement, planning and building rights, the rights to unrestricted cultural and educational development, and freedom of association should all be placed at the center rather than the periphery of international policy. In parallel to this disastrous policy and challenging its intentions, the past 10 years have actually seen growing interdependence between Israelis and Palestinians within the city across various municipal, economic, cultural, and even social issues. During the coronavirus crisis, the important roles held by Palestinian residents in essential work, from transportation to highly professional medical care, has become ever more evident. Jerusalem is the only place in the entire region in which Israelis and Palestinians, I don't mean citizens of Israel, share an urban space. While incidents of tension often receive high level of media and public attention, manifestation of delicate coexistence and even solidarity, albeit under profoundly unequal terms, are often overlooked. Today, neither Israelis nor Palestinians view the future of the city as one that is physically divided. Rather, a sustainable political resolution to the city should employ complex strategies that bear in mind the everyday reality. A secure and stable life in Jerusalem can exist only out of recognition of the connections of both people to the city, and when both are able to conduct their daily and public life in an independent and sovereign manner. In the absence of a permanent solution in the foreseeable future, the two peoples will continue to share a complex urban reality. In this reality, the living condition of East Jerusalem residents, both within and outside the separation barrier, must be seriously and immediately addressed. Palestinians must be permitted to physically and socially develop their communities in the urban sphere, preserve the wholeness of their community and their physical surrounding, and conduct their affairs in the city through their own institutions without fear. Living conditions in West Jerusalem also require improvement, while positive economic, social, and political channels for dialogue and cooperation must be established. The residents of both parts of Jerusalem and their respective political leadership, along with the support of the international community, must be full and equal partners in determining the political future of the city. This shared life in the city can and must constitute a basis for negotiation for a viable, sustainable solution, out of the understanding that in every possible political constellation, these two peoples will live alongside each other in Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judith, and also for starting to paint the picture of reality and what might needs to happen going forward. We'll turn now to Ariel Kane as our next panelist. And let me just introduce you, Ariel, if I may. Dr. Ariel Kane is a Jerusalem-born artist and a researcher whose practice focuses on the intersection of spatial, that's three-dimensional photography, modeling, and survey technologies, and their operation within the production of cultural memory and national narratives. Ariel finished and completed his doctorate, PhD, last year at the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmith College, University of London. And he is a researcher and a project coordinator at the Forensic Architecture Research Agency. Ariel is also a visiting lecturer at the Royal College of Art, and also he exhibits and publishes his work internationally. Over to you, Ariel.
Very much. Everyone, thanks for inviting me to speak. I'm standing in here for Professor Eyal Weizmann, but yeah, I'll jump right in as well, and I'll be reading as well from a text, as I wanted to keep it in time and succinct. Similar to a building, Israel's architectural project of occupation was arranged in layers. If we look at the spatial reconfiguration of Jerusalem since 1967, but primarily since the Oslo Accords of the mid-1990s, a process which promised incremental pathways to reconciliation, but ended up providing the skeletons of the existing geographical system of domination and control, we can see that the territory was in fact divided into a stack made out of three principal political layers. The surface, landlocked pockets which were handed over to Palestinian control, to varying degrees of Palestinian controls. The subsoil, the underground, which includes water, mineral resources, as well as the archaeological strata, and the airspace above Palestinian areas, which was left in Israeli hands, primarily of its Air Force, but also, of course, different policing units. An interpretation of the Ottoman land code from the mid-19th century helped Israel take legal control over the uncultivated lands, which were located primarily on the barren hilltops, leaving lower cultivated valleys in Palestinian hands. And on these hilltops, which are also important for territorial control, Israel, under its own legal kind of okay, so to speak, constructed its settlements. The two national populations therefore became intertwined and intermingled everywhere across the terrain. A third population, less discussed perhaps within this conflict, is one of the Palestinian Bedouin tribes and families, most of whom were living in either semi-nomadic or fully sedentary ways. And prior to 1948, primarily also in the Nakab region, in the south of Israel and Palestine. These forcefully displaced in the early 1950s, they lost access to their original lands and were forced into more arid areas, such as the southern Nakab, but more relevant to our panel here, they were forced into areas such as the Judean hills to the east of to the area of Ma'ale Adumim, down to the Dead Sea. The Palestinian Bedouin Nakba, which started in 1948, continues to this day through the ongoing demolitions, displacement, and dispossession, an example of which could be seen in the recent ongoing case in Khan el-Ahmar near Ma'ale Adumim. Here too, physical dispossession is enabled by legal interpretations and legislation that undermines Bedouin sedentary existence by categorizing it as nomadic and therefore devoid of land rights. Leading on from the fragmentation of space into settlement islands on hilltops and at the heart of Palestinian neighborhoods necessitates a further degree of three-dimensional complexity. A road network was set up connecting the hilltop settlements with bridges that span over Palestinian fields and with tunnels that burrow underneath them. Palestinian neighborhoods have been thus fully enveloped by Israeli space in 3 dimensions. If Palestinian wants to drive out of their enclave, they encounter a fence, a wall, or a checkpoint. If they want to dig a well, or they need Israeli permission to pierce into the subterranean volume. If they want to fly outside of Israel, they need Israeli permission. And this is what Professor Eyal Weizmann previously called, or he called this layered political structure, the politics of verticality. Verticality became a form of and a force of separation.
Ariel?
Yeah?
Sorry to interrupt you, but some of our participants are struggling to fully hear you. If you can, they're asking if you can just slow down a little bit.
Okay, sorry. I'll attempt. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this, which hopefully could be heard and understood, this separation is not only on the surface of the ground, but also runs underneath it. Deep subterranean aquifers buried under layers of aggregate soil and rock, which run from the Jerusalem mountains towards the sea on the west and towards the West Bank, were unevenly partitioned in the Oslo Accord, with approximately 80% of the resources going to the Israeli side. Another subterranean strata is that of archaeology. The buried remains of the land's historical occupants should be subject to impartial scientific study, but the Zionists, an Israeli project, uses archaeology in some cases to construct an alibi for Jewish return and the claim that its indigenous rights, the Jewish indigenous rights, are more fundamental and prior to the others. One such site, as an example, is that of the City of David archaeological excavation taking place at the heart of the Palestinian village of Silwan and the Wadi Khilwe neighborhood. Excavations at this site were first carried out by the Palestine Exploration Fund in the 1860s, there have been multiple excavations throughout the 20th century as well, but since the 90s approximately, there's been a shift in these excavations. And promoted by Elad, a Settler Association organization, Excavation started without proper permits, searching for elements of the King David era Jerusalem by boring tunnels through the hillside underneath Palestinian homes and without informing residents or securing their consent, refusing to stop despite implicit protests and several attempts to halt these works in the courts. The underground works, first a haphazard collection of improvised tunnels fortified with tons of steel and concrete, and then a fully formalized and supported engineering project, were and still are done in hand with the archaeologists of the Israeli Authority of Antiquity, promoted by the municipality for whom the site is one of the biggest tourist attraction sites. The digs and the destabilization they produce, moving up through the geological layers towards the surface, appearing and disappearing as they find lines of least resistance, cutting through streets, homes, schools, mosques, such as the Ein Silwan Mosque, digging for ruins of ancient Jewish archaeology, producing layers of ruin in contemporary Palestinian life. To conclude, archaeology is politicized in other countries, drones are employed elsewhere, and other countries still divide water unequally. There's nothing inherently different in this situation, only that here, these layers are woven into a complete system. However, this layered arrangement, this politics of verticality, is rarely grasped in its totality, and each layer is presented as a haphazard, often merely a functional solution to a separate problem. One layer makes sure hilltops are seized by the state, another constructs a settlement, another restricts the building around Palestinian neighborhoods in the name of environmental rights, regulations, clean air regulations, green areas, cultural heritage. Another restricts access to underground water. So it is the perceived separation between these layers that makes the politics of verticality so effective and so resilient. And moreover, it makes it an attractive model for other countries that seek to form this type of population control. One way of responding and countering this reality of separation is through the practices and analysis that reconnect these strata across space, history, and most importantly, through the civic collaboration and community-led practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ariel, and especially for bringing in the architectural and archaeological picture of what is going on and has been going on in Jerusalem. Also, thank you for accepting to contribute despite the short notice. Very grateful for that. Let me now move, last but not least, to our final panelist, Rula Salameh. And Rula is the Outreach Director in Palestine for Just Vision. She is a producer, and she's produced Budros, Naila and Uprising, and My Neighborhood. She joined Ma'an News Agency in 2009 as a journalist, and then she became senior producer and project coordinator. From 2011, she's been a TV presenter for a weekly TV show at Ma'an Satellite Channel. And subsequently, she registered her TV show as an NGO in Palestine. And now that TV show is one of the best programs in Palestine. Rula has an international diploma in computers and business and management from Cambridge International College and studied sociology at Birzeit University in Ramallah. And she's based in Jerusalem. Thank you, Rula, and over to you.
Hi, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for my colleagues. And yes, Daniel, I'm here. Thank you. I heard you. It's really hard to have my speech, to be the last person after these, great kind of like introduction of how is the to be a Palestinian or to be an Israelis who live in Jerusalem, how to see everything, the daily life of the Palestinians and Israelis, And to be based in Jerusalem, it's really very complicated even to explain to anybody who do not have maybe the privilege of living here in East Jerusalem to understand the very complicated situation here. I'll start by talking about my experience as a journalist who tried for the last nearly 20 years to highlight the life, the complicated life of the Palestinians in the West Bank and Jerusalem. And the focus was the last few years in Jerusalem, especially when we decided to do our one of our films, My Neighborhood in Jerusalem, and especially to highlight the stories of the Palestinians who lived in Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem and who were kicked out of their homes. And some of them have to share their homes with the settlers. So imagine the life of these families who moved from Jaffa and inside Israel in 48 to the old city of Jerusalem, and then to move to the Sheikh Jarrah. And after more than 50, 60 years, they have now to move again from their homes, which is like all the stories about Sheikh Jarrah and the eviction is really very complicated even to explain for those who do not have really know all the details about the Sheikh Jarrah story. So I'll just talk about from my point of view as a journalist who really find it very complicated even to explain it to the young generation about what is mean to live in Jerusalem. First of all, we really practice the occupation every day, every hour here in Jerusalem, before Corona and during Corona, in winter and in summer, with the soldiers all over the West Bank and Jerusalem, with the demolishing houses every day, with the practice of the police before and now with the Corona, running after people to wear the masks, with the way how they use violence against kids and against women here, especially in my neighborhood. I practice this every day, many times, to see the violence and the violence against kids and against women, young women. It's hard to talk about what's going on in Jerusalem and to explain it. It's really, there's like 20, 30 elements where I have to raise them all because as a Palestinian who suffered from the occupation, as a Palestinian who have like really very bad experience with my own story, and I'll share my own story just in few words because my own story is like one example of tens of thousands of Palestinian families who have this really very traumatic story, which is if you get married to a Palestinian from the West Bank, or you get married to a Palestinian or an Arab from any of the Arab countries, or from Gaza, which is the worst cases, is how you will not be able to register your kids and to get an Israeli birth certificate if you was even born and raised in Jerusalem. You are not allowed to register your kids and to help them to get an Israeli ID in the future. Imagine, like in my case, I delivered my son in Dubai, in United Arab Emirates, and I was married in the United Arab Emirates. And when I decided to deliver my son, my Israeli lawyer advised me to return back and deliver my son in Jerusalem so I can get a birth certificate and an Israeli ID number for my son. This did not happen. This is not the case for the Palestinians in Jerusalem. We are not even, they do not recognize us as even deal with us as an equal situation with Israelis, with the Jewish here in the West, in West Jerusalem. Imagine like for around 22,000 Palestinian families, they have a serious problem having registered their sons and daughters in schools because we don't have a birth certificate. Imagine the problem if you have your husband or your wife with an Israeli ID, one of them with an Israeli ID and the other one from the West Bank. You need to have two homes, one in Jerusalem and one in the West Bank, because you will, if you are lucky, you will get at least a permit for your husband or your wife to enter Jerusalem maybe once a year or twice a year, because we have a serious problem with the reunification for the families. Imagine that your kids have to be spread, like part of them with the father, the other part with the mother. Or for the best scenario, you will stay, the wife will stay with because she have a Jerusalem ID with her kids in Jerusalem, and over the weekend they have to move to the West Bank so they can spend some time with the husband. This is something so hard to explain it to the international community. It's hard to explain that for the Palestinian men or women from Jerusalem, we are not allowed to choose our husband or our wife because we have a limitation. You have to choose your husband or your wife from Jerusalem, because if you do not choose them from here, from this city, then you will really spend 10, 15, 20 years asking for special permits for them. And we have a case with an activist from East Jerusalem, from Sheikh Jarrah, Amal al-Qasim, who was activist, and she get married to a Palestinian from Gaza, and for 23 years he was on this list that kind of like wanted list. They call it wanted list, that he's like, for security reasons they can't allow him to enter to Jerusalem. And the only time he managed to get a permit when his wife Amal passed away last year. This was the first time that he managed to see the family house where his wife and the kids were spent all their life. And the weekend they have to move to Ramallah and they can meet as a family in one house. This is only one story of what we face as Palestinians here. Imagine that for our what happened with Muhammad Abu Khdair when he was kidnapped and burned. I remember this case when my son Marwan was in school in the old city. I have to find like a bodyguard and a taxi driver to take him every day to the school and bring him back, because I have to go to my work in Ramallah or Bethlehem, and then who will take care of him? I was really afraid that something will happen to him, because maybe the settlers, maybe the violence will spread again, maybe something will happen, or like a bombing or something, that my only son will get, maybe he will get kidnapped or something bad will happen to him. This was not only my case, like all the neighborhood, all the mothers and the fathers, they were thinking and they were like, what is the best way to protect our sons and daughters? So imagine, like, you can't put him in the house and prevent him from spending time with friends. You have to go and to your work, and you have to concentrate on your work. And then what about your sons and daughters if they are in schools? And you know, the situation in Jerusalem at that time was really like violence spread all over Jerusalem. Imagine that we woke up every day about hearing about demolishing houses, about attacking like a family, or running after, or like the ambulances because somebody was killed or others were injured. We always hear the situation in Silwan and what's going on in Silwan with the families. We were hearing about 88 families that maybe suddenly they will receive eviction orders and they have to leave their homes. What will happen to these families and with the kids? What about the kids and the children in schools? Last year, we were in a meeting in Jerusalem, in one of the hotels in Jerusalem, where the security forces, the Israelis, the intelligence attacked the meeting, because we were thinking what we need to do to protect The students, we have around 10,000 Palestinian students who do not have one seat in the schools in East Jerusalem. The Palestinian Authority can't support any building, support any school in Jerusalem. We have a serious problem in getting funds for schools in Jerusalem. And we have a serious problem that Palestinians in East Jerusalem, they need to register their sons and daughters in schools inside the wall in East Jerusalem, not outside the wall. Even if outside the wall now is still part of Jerusalem, like at least Palestinians who have the ideas, who were affected by building the wall, we lost around 100,000 Palestinians with an Israeli ideas after building the wall. Instead of being like around 300,000 Palestinians, 300,000 maybe, or a little bit more, 1,000 Palestinians in Jerusalem, after building the wall, around 100,000 Palestinians were outside the wall. And I think sooner or later they will lose their residence in Jerusalem, and they will be in really bad situation. Imagine that even like some of the families were divided. Some of them they are inside the wall, and the others they are outside the wall. And this affects the whole family, the students who go to school inside Jerusalem. And with the checkpoints, the terrible experience for kids is the Kalandia checkpoints and the Hizma checkpoints, and the Shafat checkpoints, which is around separate Shafat refugee camp with Jerusalem. Imagine the experience, the daily experience. You know, as an activist with different women organizations in Jerusalem, you know that many females, many Palestinian families decide to stop their young women from going, their daughters from going to schools, because they have to cross that checkpoint, and they can't allow them to have this experience because maybe something will happen to them. I mean, this really affected the education system in Jerusalem. To go further than that, about the Palestinian curriculums, we have serious issues with the Palestinian curriculums, bring them to Jerusalem, because Israel prevents the Palestinian schools in East Jerusalem to use Palestinian curriculums. So we have to use the Israeli curriculums, and there in the curriculums, there's no mention of Palestinians or anything related to the history of the Palestinians. So this is also another issue. We have also a serious problem. Yeah.
Could you just, sorry, it's important what you say, but I also would like some conversation. Yeah. Could you come to an end, maybe another minute?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, also the problem of the municipality that also Daniel Levy were talking about the municipality. The Palestinians in Jerusalem feel here in Jerusalem that we can't elect, we can't have like go to the municipality and participate in the elections. We do not see that the municipality in West Jerusalem, the Israeli municipality of Jerusalem, do not represent us as Palestinians. We do not have any services. If we compare the situation in East and West Jerusalem, there's a big and huge gap between the services that we get and the services that the Israelis Jewish in West Jerusalem get. So why we need to have like voices there when we feel that even they do not see us as equal to them? How, I mean, many things, if you just have like somebody who will go to the neighborhood in Jerusalem, in different neighborhood, and they have the right to choose anyone, and compare it with the Israeli neighborhood in West Jerusalem and see the difference between the two neighborhoods. So, I mean, there's many things that, I mean, I need more than 1 hour just to list the things that we are suffering, but maybe in the discussion. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rula. Thank you for bringing in your direct human story to this session. As a Palestinian myself from Gaza, nowhere else, I know what I call the invisible suffering. There is a degree of visibility, and there's a lot of invisible suffering that goes on. Jerusalem is a very special case, and it's a very complex situation. I'm grateful for all the panelists for what they shared so far. I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes in maybe just trying to see how can we move forward. We are fully aware of the realities, of the inequalities, of the suffering, whether equal suffering or not. There's suffering on all sides. How can we move forward? Daniel, there was a question earlier when you were speaking, asking, this is for all of you to reflect on. What would you advise the Palestinian leadership? What would a Palestinian strategy look like to actually get out of the situation we are in? If Daniel, you could start, and maybe the others could just share your advice and thoughts. What would if you were advising the Palestinian leadership, what would you say to them? In particular, in relation to the situation in Jerusalem. And maybe I'll just add something else, Daniel, you also said at the beginning, which just struck me. You were referring to the one state, two states, and you said that neither is on the agenda. And what should be on the agenda is how do we protect rights? So maybe we just need to see how can we improve the conditions and the lives and bring in equal treatment, equal rights to all people in the land. Any thoughts, Daniel, and followed by the other panelists?
We've got till midnight, right? So absolutely, and this issue of not being distracted by this Oslo process. There's a debate over what the intention was. The reality today is clear. It provides cover for everything Rula just described to us. And so if one prioritizes, and I'm talking here as a set of international actors, and I'll come on to what I mean by that. If one prioritizes addressing what Rula brought up, a reality in Jerusalem, of course, a reality that is reflected in Palestinian circumstances, in Palestinian disenfranchisement, in the matrix of control imposed on Palestinians in Jerusalem throughout the occupied territories. Different, but not equal inside Israel itself as well. The municipality, of course, does not represent Palestinians. I was making the case earlier that if there is a shift to an equal rights strategy, one of the things that might flow from that is, which I don't expect to happen now, but if that was the consensus kind of Palestinian collective position, does one utilize the limited opening, but it's a real opening that exists in that municipal situation to challenge that, then see how Israel pushes back and how Israel closes down that space as I imagine it would. It's not for me, and certainly not in a public forum to tell the Palestinian leadership what they should be doing. What I do think is that what we have right now is a Palestinian strategy that is not disruptive of that status quo. Rula has made the film she mentioned earlier. If people haven't seen Naila and the Uprising, that really puts some very challenging questions to what that strategy is. And I would probably want to echo the questions that came up from the women who are covered in that movie, who that movie follows. While you have an authority structurally now, you have a situation where there was an authority dependent on Israeli goodwill, dependent on donor goodwill. That structurally, inherently, is not the basis from which to build a struggle and a strategy disruptive of the very status quo that keeps the Palestinian Authority in existence. So it can't play that role. Us from the outside, who aren't going to define a Palestinian strategy for the Palestinians, but I think we at least should desist from intervening in unhelpful ways in Palestinian politics, in imposing conditions on Palestinian national reconciliation that have not been imposed with good intent or tried in any conflict situation that are not asked of Israel. The way that aid money is structured in order to limit Palestinian options, the way Palestinians are punished for pursuing legitimate non-violent options in the international community.
Yep.
And that's not just a Trump phenomenon. Yep. And look, you know, there's been various comments on the side. Yeah, undoubtedly, anti-Semitism is being weaponized to try to limit Palestinian free speech and limit what Palestinians can say and do politically. And we all collectively have to push back against that. We also don't effectively push back against that by making common cause with anti-Semites. So when someone on the side says, who controls Hollywood? If anyone thinks that is advancing Palestinian rights, then think again.
That doesn't. Thanks, Daniel. Sorry to cut you short, just time. No, thank you. So to the other panelists, and what I'm really looking for in those last few minutes is a glimpse of hope, some agency. What can and should happen? What's your thoughts on going forward, please? The floor is open. Who would like to go first? Judith? You're muted, please. You're still muted, Judith.
Okay, so I support what Daniel said about the need for new strategies. I think that until not long ago, the Israeli strategy was to consolidate United Jerusalem and to impose all these pressures on Palestinians, and Palestinians were I think we have to say that, were very successful in their tumud, I hope I said that right, strategies. I mean, they maintain in the city despite of everything. But what we they are almost 40% of the city population actually making Jerusalem a binational rather than Israeli city as Israeli would like to see. But in the past few years, and with the ongoing Israeli right-wing government supported by the Trump administration, we have seen a move from maintaining the conflict to actually moving forward in unilaterally determining the terms of the end games. And of the entire conflict and in Jerusalem. And here I agree that we need the opposite strategies. And in this case, I agree with Daniel again that it is not for us to tell the Palestinians what to do. But for example, in the case of the elections, there was an attempt in the last municipal elections to challenge the elections in a quite a creative way by a Palestinian candidate who ran for mayor. And he cannot, by the law, run for mayor because only Israeli citizen can run for mayor. Namely, the discrimination is structured in the system that sort of allowing these crumbs of democracy for Palestinians. So I think this was quite a creative way of even if it was pushed back, and they would all be pushed back. And I see in the civil society in East Jerusalem, there is lots happening, and lots of creativity and creative thinking and very activist kind, lots of new activism. Whereas, and if we have to end with a positive note, I think that it is there in the civil society of both West and East Jerusalem, and particularly in East Jerusalem. It's a vivid, it's a creative, it's an innovative civil society, and new ideas come from there. Otherwise, Rula, you broke my heart. Although I know everything, I mean not everything. I know a lot about this situation, and yet, you know, it's leaving us speechless.
I think, Dr. Imad, I just want to say something. about the civil society. I think we are lucky here that everything is working against us to give us the power, because here in Jerusalem, it's not easy to live, but also it's not easy for us to live. I think this is why we teach our sons and daughters that, I mean, even with everything, with the occupation, with practicing every day, with the hard life that we are living, but still, like Jerusalem, for us really deserve what we are seeing and practicing. This is why, like for my son, for him, it's the luxury life in Dubai and the United Arab Emirates did not really take him out from Jerusalem when he decided to study. He said, I'll study here, I'll stay here. And this is he and his team with like 10 young men who have the opportunity to go to UK, to go to USA, to study there. They decide to stay here to serve the community. And maybe with the corona, and this is what you mentioned just Judith now with the community, what we practice with the NGOs, with the organizations, with the community in Jerusalem during corona, we worked so hard to support the community with the ignoring from the Israeli government. They left us without anything, with no mask, with no help, with no support at the beginning. We decide, and the Palestinian Authority, they prevent the Palestinian Authority from giving us any support. They took, I mean, all the food packages, all the medicine, all the masks that the Palestinian Authority tried to give to the Palestinian community in Jerusalem. It was taken away by the Israeli Authority, by the police, by the soldiers. We decide in the community here in Jerusalem, we decide to have different groups to support the community and maybe different initiatives. I have at least 13, 14 initiatives that I was part of with the community, with old men and women. And we return back to the first Intifada practice, how we used to support each other. And this is like lessons learned from Naila and Uprising, where I have to give the credit to my Just Vision team, who when I mentioned to them that what's going on here, and they came for years and years to see the situation in Jerusalem, we decided to focus on making films about the Palestinian life here, so we can take the films to the international world and say, like, come and see what the Palestinians are facing, the daily life of the Palestinians under the Israeli occupation in Jerusalem and in the West Bank. So this is really kind of like, this is the hope, that with everything that we are facing, we are still here. We still have the hope. We still have the willing to support the community, and we will continue. This is Dr. Imad, also Gaza. We learned from Gaza, and we are learning from Isawiya, and we are learning from Silwan, and we are learning from Shafat refugee camp. This is like real models and real stories that every Palestinian should be proud. And we have to say that we have a lot of Israeli activists, professors and doctors and activists. Because of them, we managed to be to get the support and to continue and to widen the support. In Budros, we have an activist. In Sheikh Jarrah, we have an Israeli activist who support us. So it's like, yes, we are here and we will stay here, and we need the support from the international community. Maybe the Arab countries just left us, they turned their back, but I mean, we still have the power.
Thank you, Rula, absolutely. So we're about to close. So Ariel, would you like to share any final thoughts, please?
Yeah, I'll do it quickly.
Comments? Yes,
I mean,
please.
I join everyone. I mean, Rula, Yudith, and Daniel, all of what. And I mean, I agree and join all of what you said. That maybe as a final thing, echoing also what I tried to say during the talk and during my little piece, which I'm not sure people managed to understand. Maybe, I mean, if Oslo and kind of the Israeli regime was about disconnection and isolating and slowing things down, slowing movement down, I think what we also hear from everyone here is that there's really a need to interconnect through civil society. So use activists from different places, different neighborhoods, across the borders, interconnect both the spatial elements and the civic elements, learning from not only from Palestine, but also from other struggles all around the world, where people are kind of using different forms of media and community practice to overcome and retell the stories on the one hand, and challenge the legal structures and the civic and state structures that are basically grounding everything to a halt. And therefore, yeah, it's really down to, I agree that it's down to activist and community practices across the borders and across the municipal borders and the national borders. Yeah.
Thank you, Ariel. I'll just briefly say that what gives me hope is people like you, all of you here, I'm looking at the screen, Palestinian and Israeli, Jewish and Muslim and Christian. Well, in being principled and wanting to fight for what is right, for human rights, for equality, and having the courage to speak up and not giving up. So the fight for justice, for equality for all continues, as far as I am concerned. Thank you so much, all of you, Daniel, Yudith, Ariel, and Rula, for this very moving session and informative session. So thank you so much.